In a dark, dark wood, there was a dark, dark path, and down the dark, dark path, there was a dark, dark gate, and through the dark, dark gate, there was a dark, dark courtyard, and past the dark, dark courtyard, there was a dark, dark house, and in the dark, dark house, there was a dark, dark hall, and down the dark, dark hall, there was a dark, dark stair, and down the dark, dark stair, there was a dark, dark room, and in the dark, dark room. Oh dear. I hope you're not afraid of the dark. Good thing it looks like there's someone here to keep you company. I'm Lucas Brandon, and you're listening to Tale of Tales. Sit closer to the fire, and I'll tell you a story I heard once a long time ago. It's a dark, dark world out there. Mother Nature is harsh and unforgiving. The sun burns us, the snow freezes us, the rain soaks us to the bone. It's no wonder that humans, like most animals, are so keen to build shelters around ourselves to keep out the elements. From those first ancestors of ours who dwelt in caves or constructed houses of mud and clay and straw to keep them insulated and dry, we've been building and building and building, raising homes within whose four walls we find a sense of safety and security. In our homes we feel roosted, cozy, untouchable. If we build them well enough, that pesky nature can't get in to bother us. Of course, much of the warmth we feel in our homes comes not just from the physical safety we feel there, but from the memories we make there, the loved ones we cuddle up with, the happy moments we experience. A good home is not just an anti-nature shelter. It's a part of the family, really. It's no wonder that we have become so sentimentally attached to our homes that we might not ever want to leave them. A young man and his wife were on a trip to visit his mother. Usually they arrived in time for supper, but they had gotten a late start, and now it was getting dark. So they decided to look for a place to stay overnight and go on in the morning. Just off the road they saw a small house in the woods. "Maybe they rent rooms," the wife said. So they stopped to ask. An elderly man and woman came to the door. They didn't rent rooms, they said, but they would be glad to have them stay overnight as their guests. They had plenty of room, and they would enjoy the company. The old woman made coffee and brought out some cake, and the four of them talked for a while. Then the young couple were taken to their room. They again explained that they wanted to pay for this, but the old man said he would not accept any money. The young couple got up early the next morning before their hosts had awakened. On a table near the front door, they left an envelope with some money in it for the room. Then they went on to the next town. They stopped in a restaurant and had breakfast. When they told the owner where they had stayed, he was shocked. "That can't be," he said. "That house burned to the ground, and the man and the woman who lived there died in the fire." The young couple could not believe it, so they went back to the house. Only now, there was no house. All they found was a burnt-out shell. They stood staring at the ruins, trying to understand what had happened. Then the woman screamed. In the rubble was a badly burned table, like the one they had seen by the front door. On the table was the envelope they had left that morning. This tale was recorded by Alvin Schwartz in the first book of his Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark series, under the title The Guests. Schwartz's wife Barbara grew up in Albany, New York, and heard the story frequently told as an event that had actually happened somewhere in the area, although the story itself is attested in many other places. Schwartz himself mentions a version collected by Louis C. Jones in the 1950s. Jones's informant, son of Cooper, said the story took place at least 50 years prior, which meant that the couple in the tale Cooper told traveled by carriage, not car. Interestingly, Cooper specified that the guests left 50 cents on the table as payment for their room, and explained that at the time this was a fair amount to pay for a room. In actuality, 50 cents in 1900 couldn't have been much more than $15 in today's currency. Of course, whether or not the couple stiffed their ghostly hosts is besides the point here. If you're like me, you're likely wondering how in the world two very living, real human beings could spend the night comfortably in a house that in fact didn't exist, hosted by a pair of ghosts. The tale itself reads like a dramatic reversal of the common vanishing hitchhiker story, in which someone picks up a hitchhiker on the side of the road, only for this new passenger to vanish before they reach the destination. The driver then finds out that their passenger was, in fact, the ghost of someone who had died along that stretch of road and now haunts it, still seeking to come back home, even after death. For the two ghosts and the guests, home is clearly also valuable to them. So valuable, in fact, that the home itself has also become a ghost, capable of manifesting once more in the world of the living. The Guests plays on our attachment to our homes, not just in terms of the two ghosts' inability to leave theirs. The young couple in the story are themselves away from home, traveling to another home. The chilling quality of the story revolves around this liminal state, the state of in-between. Whatever might happen to us when we are away from the safety and comfort of our homes? And how might we be treated when we find ourselves as guests in someone else's home? These are questions as old as literature, in fact. They're central to the Odyssey, one of the oldest and most beloved epic poems of all time, so we can safely assume that humans have been asking these questions for as long as they've had homes. In the end, it all goes back to the primal yearning for safety and security. We all love home because it provides us a space where the outside can't get in to hurt us. Except, of course, what if what's inside with us is also just as dangerous? Throughout human history, it has only been fairly recently that we've begun living in homes that are not our own. For millennia, humans lived on their ancestral lands, in houses passed down from one generation to the next. If anything was amiss within the house, things missing, things broken, strange noises or visions, then the solution was typically a demon, an imp, or a sprite. Some sort of outside force that had gotten in somehow and had to be expelled. But with the age of exploration, and then the Western expansion, and the Industrial Revolution, humans in our corner of the world got far more used to leaving ancestral homes behind in favor of newer ones, in places where they might find more opportunity. However, just because a home may be new to us, that doesn't mean that it is new entirely. More than likely, it, or the land it's built on, belonged to others before us, and those others may still be inextricably connected to it, even beyond death. This is why haunted houses have become such a staple of post-exploration folklore here in the West. Whereas before, there were only a few examples of hauntings in the Western canon, ghost-infested homes are now worth a dime a dozen. You see, when we humans buy a home, or build one on land we didn't previously live on, there's an element of distrust. We can't know for sure that whoever lived here previously has quite moved on, and they may not take too kindly to uninvited guests. Perhaps the most prominent example of a haunted house in our modern popular culture is the Amityville Horror. If you've read the book or seen the movies, you can probably recall the more outstanding details. In 1975, Kathy Lutz, her husband George, and their 3 children moved into a large secluded house in Amityville, New York, only to be plagued by disembodied voices yelling to get out, glowing eyes and ghastly faces staring in their windows, missing or moving objects, walls oozing blood, freak illnesses and nightmares, and even a swarm of flies that chased a priest out of the house. The family's research into the house yielded reports of Native American burial sites, a satanic cult that had once operated on the property, and even a very recent mass murder committed within the house. And so, less than a month after they had moved in, the Lutzes fled, later taping roughly 45 hours of recollections that would be adapted by journalist Jay Anson for The Amityville Horror, the book that would make their experiences known to the public and inspire a long series of horror movies about the house. Take one look at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, especially at night, and it's easy to be convinced of its haunted quality. With its two eye-like top windows, dark, nose-like chimney, and protruding bottom jaw, the house simply looks as if it's ready to swallow up some unsuspecting innocent family. The only problem with all of this? The story, in its entirety, was a hoax. There is no evidence of satanic activity on the property, nor do Native American historical records confirm that the spot was ever used as a burial ground. The priest that was supposedly chased from the house by the spirits changed his story often over the course of the book's publication, at first alleging he's never even been to the house, and then stating he wasn't sure anything paranormal had happened there. Yes, Ronald DeFeo Jr. did murder his family in the house the year before Kathy Lutz and her family moved in. But it was common knowledge at the time, and what's more, DeFeo's own lawyer, William Weber, openly admitted to meeting with the Lutzes and helping them craft their story, quote, over many bottles of wine. When the Lutzes sued Weber and several other people involved in reporting the story, the judge, Jack B. Weinstein, officially stated, "It is a very serious ethical question when lawyers become literary agents." And families that have lived in the house since the Lutzes have been happy to report that the most disturbing thing haunting the house is the legacy of the Lutzes' story, which plagues them with very human visitors that regularly trespass on the property because of their obsession with the book and movies. It would seem that if there are, in fact, ghosts in the house trying to get rid of people, they are doing an absolutely horrid job of it. In spite of the overwhelming evidence against the Lutzes' story, theirs and others like it have certainly become the standard for haunted horror stories in her modern media. However, in the Western canon of ghost lore dealing with stays in haunted houses, a surprising number of them have to do not with people unwittingly hosted by ghosts, but with people who dare to venture into the haunted house, fully aware of the terror awaiting them within. One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they would always get scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house, went on in, built himself a good fire, and lit a lamp, sat there reading the Bible. Then, just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. Then there was a lot of thrashing around and struggling, and finally, everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and started mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, and step, 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 up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed, like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The old preacher waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and he shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again, slowly. Step, 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 step. Closer and closer, step, step. And it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. Then the knob slowly turned, and the door opened wide. This time the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you, and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman, about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and the flesh was dropping off her face so we could see her bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light way back in her eye sockets. And she had no nose on her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in a cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of the little finger from her left hand and to lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said,
"If you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, and you can give it to the church."
The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down toward the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming like he was crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder, and they took him to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to that house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearthrug. He did, and he found a big sack of money. And where the haunt had held on to his coat, the print of those bony fingers was burned right into the cloth. It never did come out. Alvin Schwartz, who aptly named this Virginian story The Haunted House in his first Scary Stories book, demonstrated in his notes that as ghost stories go, most are not dangerous, but merely seem to have some unfinished business that they need done before they can rest. As folklorist Maria Leach puts it, sometimes, quote, "A ghost is some poor, harmless soul looking for someone with enough understanding and kindness to speak to it and do it some little favor." End quote. Perhaps the first ever report of a haunted house comes to us from the ancient Roman magistrate Pliny the Younger, who wrote a letter in which he told the story of a big house in Athens, where a typical night's stay began with the sound of rattling iron chains drawing slowly closer and closer and closer, until, quote, a spectre appeared in the form of an old man of extremely emaciated and squalid appearance, end quote. The occupants of the house were so mercilessly plagued by the spirit that they would invariably die of stress or desert the place, until finally the house had been on the market so long and at such a cheap price as to pique the curiosity of a visiting philosopher named Athenodorus. Athenodorus rented the house for a night and whiled away the time reading and writing, to keep his mind sharp so that he wouldn't be fooled by his imagination. When the chain rattling started up, he dismissed it and kept studying. When the ghost itself appeared before him in all its gruesome glory, Pliny tells us that Athenodorus gestured to it to wait until he was done with his work. The impatient and likely very shocked apparition rattled its chains directly at him to demand his attention, and then led him to a particular spot in the house before vanishing. Like the preacher in our earlier story, a quick dig confirmed that the ghost's corpse had been buried beneath the floor of the house there, shackled with iron chains. A father had 2 sons. The oldest one was clever and intelligent, and knew how to manage everything. But the youngest one was stupid, and could neither understand nor learn anything. When people saw him, they said, "He will be a burden on his father." Now when something had to be done, it was always the oldest son who had to do it. However, if the father asked him to fetch anything when it was late, or even worse, at night, and if the way led through the churchyard or some other spooky place, he would always answer, "Oh no, Dad, I won't go there. It makes me shudder." For he was afraid. In the evening, by the fire, when stories were told that made one's flesh creep, the listeners sometimes said, "Oh, that makes me shudder." The youngest son would sit in a corner and listen with the others, but he could not imagine what they meant. "They are always saying, 'It makes me shudder, it makes me shudder.' It does not make me shudder. That too must be a skill that I do not understand." Now, it happened that one day his father said to him, "Listen, there in the corner. You are getting big and strong. You too will have to learn something by which you can earn your bread. See how your brother puts himself out? But there seems to be no hope for you." "Well, father," he answered, "I do want to learn something. Indeed, if possible, I would like to learn how to shudder. I don't understand that at all yet." The oldest son laughed when he heard that, and thought to himself, "Dear God, what a dimwit that brother of mine is. Nothing will come of him as long as he lives. As the twig is bent, so grows the tree." The father sighed and answered him, "You may well learn to shudder, but you will not earn your bread by shuddering." Soon afterward, the sexton came to the house on a visit, and the father complained to him about his troubles, telling him how his younger son was so stupid in everything that he knew nothing and was learning nothing. "Just think," he said, "when I asked him how he was going to earn his bread, he actually asked to learn to shudder." "If there is nothing more than that," replied the sexton, "he can learn that with me. Just send him to me. I will plane off his rough edges." The father agreed to do this, for he thought, "It will do the boy well." So the sexton took him home with him, and he was to ring the church bell. A few days later, the sexton awoke him at midnight and told him to get up, climb the church tower, and ring the bell. "You will soon learn what it is to shudder," he thought. He secretly went there ahead of him, After the boy had reached the top of the tower, he turned around and was about to take hold of the bell rope when he saw a white figure standing on the steps opposite the sound hole. "Who's there?" he shouted. But the figure gave no answer, neither moving nor stirring. "Answer me!" shouted the boy, "or get out of here! You have no business here at night." The sexton, however, remained standing there motionless, so that the boy would think he was a ghost. The boy shouted a second time, "What do you want here? Speak if you are an honest fellow, or I will throw you down the stairs." The sexton thought, "He can't seriously mean that." He made not a sound, and stood as if he were made of stone. Then the boy shouted to him for the third time, and as that also was to no avail, he ran toward him and pushed the ghost down the stairs. It fell down 10 steps and remained lying there in a corner. Then the boy rang the bell, went home, and without saying a word, went to bed and fell asleep. The sexton's wife waited a long time for her husband, but he did not come back. Finally, she became frightened and woke up the boy, asking, "Don't you know where my husband is? He climbed up the tower before you did." "No," replied the boy, "but someone was standing by the sound hole on the other side of the steps, and because he would neither give an answer nor go away, I took him for a thief and threw him down the steps. Go there, and you will see if he was the one. I am sorry if he is." The woman ran out and found her husband, who was lying in the corner moaning. He had broken his leg. She carried him down, and then, crying loudly, she hurried to the boy's father. "Your boy," she shouted, "has caused a great misfortune. He threw my husband down the steps, causing him to break his leg. Take the good-for-nothing out of our house." The father was alarmed and ran to the sexton's house and scolded the boy. "What evil tricks are these? The devil must have prompted you to do them." "Father," he replied, "do listen to me. I am completely innocent. He was standing there in the night like someone with evil intentions. I did not know who it was, and I warned him 3 times to speak or go away." "Oh," said the father, "I have experienced nothing but unhappiness with you. Get out of my sight. I do not want to look at you any more." "Yes, father, and gladly. Just wait until daylight, and I will go forth and learn how to shudder. Then I shall have a skill that will support me." "Learn what you will," said the father. "It is all the same to me. Here are $50 for you. Take them and go into the wide world, but tell no one where you come from or who your father is, because I am ashamed of you." "Yes, father, I will do just as you wish. If that is all you want from me, I can easily remember it." So, at daybreak, the boy put his $50 into his pocket and went forth on the main road, continually saying to himself, "If only I could shudder! If only I could shudder!" A man came up to him and heard this conversation that the boy was holding with himself, and when they had walked a little farther to where they could see the gallows, the man said to him, "Look, there is the tree where 7 men got married to the rope-maker's daughter, and are now learning how to fly. Sit down beneath it, and wait until night comes, and then you will learn how to shudder." "There's nothing more to it than that," answered the boy. "I can do it easily. But if I learn how to shudder that quickly, you shall have my $50. Just come back to me tomorrow morning." Then the boy went to the gallows, sat down beneath them, and waited until evening. Because he was cold, he made himself a fire. However, at midnight, there came up such a cold wind that in spite of his fire, he could not get warm. And as the wind pushed the hanged men against each other, causing them to move to and fro, he thought, "You are freezing down here next to the fire. Those guys up there must really be freezing and suffering." Feeling pity for them, he put up the ladder and climbed up, untied them one after the other, and then brought them all down. Then he stirred up the fire, blew into it, and set them all around it to warm themselves. But they just sat there, without moving, and their clothes caught fire. So he said, "Be careful, or I will hang you up again." The dead men, however, heard nothing and said nothing, and they let their rags continue to burn. This made him angry, and he said, "If you won't be careful, I can't help you. I don't want to burn up with you." So he hung them up again all in a row. Then he sat down by his fire and fell asleep. The next morning, the man came to him and wanted to have his $50. He said,
"Well, do you know how to shudder?"
"No," he answered. "Where would I have learned it? Those fellows up there did not open their mouths. They were so stupid that the few old rags which they had on their bodies catch fire." Then the man saw that he would not be getting the $50 that day. He went away, saying,
"Never before have I met such a fellow."
The boy went on his way as well, and once more began muttering to himself, "Oh, if only I could shudder! If only I could shudder!" A cart driver who was walking along behind him heard this and asked, "Who are you?" "I don't know," replied the boy. Then the cart driver asked, "Where do you come from?" "I don't know." "Who is your father?" "I'm not permitted to say." "What are you always muttering to yourself?" "Oh," replied the boy, "I want to be able to shudder, but no one can teach me how." "Stop that foolish chatter," said the cart driver. "Come, walk along with me, and I will see that I get a place for you." The boy went with the cart driver, and that evening they came to an inn where they decided to stay the night. Upon entering the main room, the boy again said quite loudly, "If only I could shudder! If only I could shudder!" Hearing this, the innkeeper laughed and said,
"If that is your desire, there should be a good opportunity for you here."
"Oh, be quiet," said the innkeeper's wife. "Too many meddlesome people have already lost their lives. It would be a pity and a shame if his beautiful eyes would never again see the light of day." But the boy said, "I want to learn to shudder, however difficult it may be. That is why I left home." He gave the innkeeper no rest until the latter told him that there was a haunted castle not far away, where a person could very easily learn how to shudder, if he just kept watch there for 3 nights. The king had promised that whoever would dare to do this could have his daughter in marriage, and she was the most beautiful maiden under the sun. Further, in the castle there were great treasures, guarded by evil spirits. These treasures would then be freed, and would make a poor man rich enough. Many had entered the castle, but no one had come out again. The next morning, the boy went to the king and said, "If it be allowed, I would keep watch 3 nights in the haunted castle." The king looked at him, and because the boy pleased him, he said,
"You may ask for 3 things to take into the castle with you, but they must be things that are not alive."
To this the boy replied, "Then I ask for a fire, a lathe, and a woodcarver's bench with a knife." The king had all these things carried into the castle for him during the day. When night was approaching, the boy went inside and made himself a bright fire in one of the rooms, placed the woodcarver's bench and knife beside it, and sat down at the lathe. "Oh, if only I could shudder," he said, "but I won't learn it here either." Towards midnight, he decided to stir up his fire. He was just blowing into it, when a cry suddenly came from one of the corners. "Meow, meow, how cold we are." "You fools," he shouted. "What are you crying about? If you are cold, come and sit down by the fire and warm yourselves." When he had said that, 2 large black cats came with a powerful leap and sat down on either side of him, looking at him savagely with their fierce eyes. A little while later, after warming themselves, they said, "Comrade, shall we play a game of cards?" "Why not?" he replied, "but first show me your paws." So they stretched out their claws. "Oh," he said, What long nails you have! Wait, first I will have to trim them for you." With that, he seized them by their necks, put them on the woodcarver's bench, and tightened them into the vise by their feet. "I have been looking at your fingers," he said, "and my desire to play cards has disappeared." And he struck them dead and threw them into the water. After he had put these two to rest, he was about to sit down again by his fire, when from every side and every corner there came black cats and black dogs on red-hot chains. More and more of them appeared until he could no longer move. They shouted horribly, then jumped into his fire and pulled it apart, trying to put it out. He quietly watched them for a little while, but finally it was too much for him, and he seized his carving knife and cried, "Away with you, you villains!" and hacked away at them. Some of them ran away, the others he killed and threw out into the pond. When he came back, he blew into the embers of his fire until they flamed up again, and he warmed himself. As he thus sat there, his eyes would no longer stay open, and he wanted to fall asleep. Looking around, he saw a large bed in the corner. "That is just where I wanted," he said, and lay down in it. However, as he was about to shut his eyes, the bed began to move by itself, going throughout the whole castle. "Jolly!" he said, "but let's go faster!" Then the bed rolled on as if 6 horses were harnessed to it, over thresholds and stairways, up and down. But then suddenly, hop, hop, it tipped upside down and lay on him like a mountain. But he threw the covers and pillows into the air, climbed out, and said, "Now anyone who wants to may ride." Then he lay down by his fire and slept until it was day. In the morning, the king came, and when he saw him lying there on the ground, he thought that the ghosts had killed him, and that he was dead. Then said he,
"It is indeed a pity to lose such a handsome person."
The boy heard this, got up, and said, "It hasn't come to that yet." The king was astonished, but glad, and asked how he had fared. "Very well," he replied. "One night has passed, the 2 others will pass as well." When he returned to the innkeeper, the latter looked astonished, and said, "I did not think that I'd see you alive again. Did you learn how to shudder?" "No," he said, "it is all in vain. If someone could only tell me how." The second night he again went up to the old castle, sat down by the fire, and began his old song once more. "If only I could shudder." As midnight was approaching, he heard a noise and commotion. At first it was soft, but then louder and louder. Then it was a little quiet, and finally, with a loud scream, half of a man came down the chimney and fell in front of him. "Hey!" he shouted. "Another half belongs here. This is too little." Then the noise began again. With roaring and howling, the other half fell down as well. "Wait," he said. "Let me blow on the fire and make it burn a little warmer for you." When he had done that and looked around again, the 2 pieces had come together, and a hideous man was sitting in his place. "That wasn't part of the wager," said the boy. "That bench is mine." The man wanted to force him aside, but the boy would not let him, instead pushing him away with force, and then sitting down again in his own place. Then still more men fell down, one after the other. They brought 9 bones from dead men and 2 skulls, and set them up and bowled with them. The boy wanted to play too, and said, "Listen, can I bowl with you?"
"Yes, if you have money."
"Money enough," he answered, "but your bowling balls are not quite round." Then he took the skulls, put them in the lathe, and turned them around. "There! Now they will roll better," he said. "Hey, this will be fun." He played with them and lost some of his money, but when the clock struck 12, everything disappeared before his eyes. He lay down and peacefully fell asleep. The next morning the king came to learn what had happened. "How did you do this time?" he asked. "I went bowling," he answered, "and lost a few pennies." "Did you shudder?" "How?" he said. "I had great fun, but if I only knew how to shudder." On the third night he sat down again on his bench and said quite sadly, "If only I could shudder." When it was late, 6 large men came in carrying a coffin. At this he said, "Aha! For certain that is my little cousin who died a few days ago." Then he motioned with his finger and cried out, "Come, little cousin, come!" They put the coffin on the ground. He went up to it and took the lid off. A dead man lay inside. He felt its face, and it was cold as ice. "Wait," he said, "I will warm you up a little." He went to the fire and warmed his own hand, then laid it on the dead man's face, but the dead man remained cold. Then he took him out, sat down by the fire, and laid him on his lap, rubbing the dead man's arms to get the blood circulating again. When that did not help either, he thought to himself, "When 2 people lie in bed together, they keep each other warm." So he carried the dead man to the bed, put him under the covers, and lay down next to him. A little while later, the dead man became warm too, and began to move. The boy said, "See, little cousin, I got you warm, didn't I?" But the dead man cried out,
I am going to strangle you.
"What?" said he. "Is that my thanks? Get back into your coffin." Then he picked him up, threw him inside, and shut the lid. Then the 6 men came and carried him away again. "I cannot shudder," he said. "I won't learn it here as long as I live." Then a man came in. He was larger than all the others, and looked frightful. But he was old, and hung a long white beard.
You wretch,
He shouted.
you shall soon learn what it is to shudder, for you are about to die.
"Not so fast," answered the boy. "If I am to die, I will have to be there,"
I've got you,
said the monster. Now, don't boast. I am just as strong as you are, and probably even stronger." "We shall see," said the old man. "If you are stronger than I am, I shall let you go. Come, let's put it to the test." Then the old man led him through dark passageways to a blacksmith's forge, took an axe, and with one blow drove one of the anvils into the ground. "I can do better than that," said the boy, and went to the other anvil. The old man stood nearby, wanting to look on. His white beard hung down. The boy seized the axe and split the anvil with one blow, wedging the old man's beard in the crack. "Now I have you," said the boy. "Now it is your turn to die." Then he seized an iron rod and beat the old man until he moaned and begged him to stop, promising that he would give him great riches. The boy pulled out the axe and released him. The old man led him back into the castle, and showed him 3 chests full of gold in a cellar.
Of these,
He said,
one is for the poor, the second one is for the king, and the third one is yours.
Meanwhile it struck 12, and the spirit disappeared, leaving the boy standing in the dark. "I can find my own way out," he said. Feeling around, he found his way to the bedroom, and fell asleep by his fire. The next morning, the king came and said,
By now you must have learned how to shudder.
"No," he answered. "What is it?" "My dead cousin was here, and a bearded man came and showed me a large amount of money down below, but no one showed me how to shudder." Then the king said,
You have redeemed the castle, and shall marry my daughter.
"That is all very well," said the boy, "but I still do not know how to shudder." Then the gold was brought up, and the wedding celebrated. But however much the young king loved his wife, and however happy he was, he still was always saying, "If only I could shudder! If only I could shudder!" With time, this made her angry. Her chambermaid said, "I can help. I know how he can learn to shudder." She went out to the brook that flowed through the garden, and caught a whole bucket full of minnows. That night, when the young king was asleep, His wife was to pull the covers off him and pour the bucket full of cold water and minnows onto him, so that the little fishes would wriggle all over him. When she did this, he woke up, crying out, "Oh, what is making me shudder? What is making me shudder? Dear wife! Yes! Now I know how to shudder!" This German tale of a fearless youth inadvertently laying a haunt fit to rival even the Amityville Horror was collected by the Brothers Grimm in their book Kinder und Hausmärchen, or Children's and Household Tales. Their first edition in 1812 contained a much shorter version of the tale, focused solely on the bowling and card playing in the castle. But a man named Ferdinand Siebert from the village of Tresa wrote to them with his own much longer version of the story, which they included in subsequent editions. The story is quite unique, in that it plays with the typical horror themes of playing a haunt by spending a night in the haunted house, but mingles comedy into the tale through the introduction of a protagonist who, we learn, through various escapades, is utterly incapable of feeling fear, and very upset about it. Whereas other protagonists might spend the night with spirits in hopes of earning treasure, or laying them to rest, the boy at the heart of our story does it simply out of hope that something in the house will finally make him feel fear. Ironically, it is none of the ghosts he encounters within the castle that make him finally shudder, but rather his new wife by tossing a bucket of cold water on him. Post-medieval problems require post-medieval solutions. The story is clearly influenced by earlier ghost stories and folk tales, but my best guess is that this specific tale was invented much closer to the Grimm's lifetime than many of the other tales in their collections, precisely because it seems to have been invented to parody those earlier stories rather than simply retell them. Whether we modern audiences realize it or not, this 18th century folktale introduced a key element to the horror genre that is now essential to the medium: humor. A car broke down late at night way out in the country. The driver remembered passing an empty house a few minutes earlier. "I'll stay there," he thought. "At least I'll get some sleep." He found some wood in the corner of the living room and made a fire in the fireplace. He covered himself with his coat and slept. Toward morning, the fire went out, and the cold awakened him. "It'll be light soon," he thought. "Then I'll go out for help." He closed his eyes again. But before he could doze off, there was a terrible crash. Something big and heavy had fallen out of the chimney. It lay on the floor for a minute, then it stood up and stared down at him. The man took one look and started running. He had never seen anything so horrible in his life. He paused just long enough to jump through a window. Then he ran and ran and ran and ran until he thought his lungs would burst. As he stood in the road panting, trying to catch his breath, he felt something tap him on the shoulder. He turned and found himself staring into two big, bloody eyes and a grinning skull. It was the horrible thing. "Pardon me," it said. "Is something wrong?" This mid-20th century African-American ghost tale, collected by Schwartz, carries on the tradition of humor and horror, a tradition which carried on in storytelling and now has gradually become a staple of scary movies. With the success of movies like Scream, The Cabin in the Woods, and the Scary Movie franchise, hardly a horror film is made nowadays that doesn't employ humor in some way. Gallows humor is, of course, a long-standing human tradition, and even just a little bit of it helps bring levity and balance to even the most terrifying of scary movies. Scary movies are, of course, like many of the tales the Grimms collected, favorite fare for teenagers and children, for better or for worse. Whether or not we condone kids consuming such gruesome content, it remains true that, for as far back as we can trace, spooky stories have proven irresistible for the young and young at heart. They not only love to listen to them or watch them, but to create and tell them as well. And a great number of scary stories exist today thanks to kids making them up, not just to creep one another out, but largely to address the very specific fears that can come with being a child or a young adult. For teenagers experiencing the first pangs of responsibility, it can be overwhelming to suddenly feel as though the weight of the world is on their shoulders, at the same time that they still feel so directionless and vulnerable. Because of this, urban legends that revolve around teenagers tend to actually lack humor, or even a positive resolution. As terrifying, or perhaps depressing, as it is to consider, the scary stories of modern youth have less to do with convincing each other that monsters can be beaten. In these stories, the things that scare us often emerge unbidden, unexpected, without origin or destination. They are footsteps in the dark, a whisper in the room, a knife just behind your back. The baddies of these stories are one-dimensional, unexplained, flat. Their only purpose in the story is to suddenly, and without warning, wreak mayhem, and then leave the young protagonist picking up the pieces. Modern scary tales do less to warn of evil and more to acknowledge it. To acknowledge the fact that all too often in our modern society, terror springs upon us without our having done anything to beckon it. It is so mysterious yet jarring that it is practically invisible, yet its effects are clear and palpable, as we see in this next selection from Schwartz's Scary Stories books. Liz was doing her homework at the dining room table. Her younger sister, Sarah, was asleep upstairs. Their mother was out, but she was expected back any minute. When the front door opened and shut, Liz called, "Hello, Mama." But her mother didn't answer, and the footsteps Liz heard were heavier, like a man's. "Who's there?" she called. No one replied. She heard whoever it was walk through the living room, then up the stairs to the second floor. The footsteps moved from one bedroom to another. Again Liz called, "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. Then she thought, "Oh my God, Sarah's in her bedroom." She ran upstairs to Sarah's room. Only Sarah was there, and she was asleep. Liz looked in the other rooms, but found no one. She went back down to the living room, scared out of her wits. Soon she heard footsteps again. They were coming down the stairs, into the living room. Now they went into the kitchen. Then, the door between the kitchen and the dining room slowly began to open. "Get out!" Liz screamed. The door slowly closed. The footsteps moved out of the kitchen, through the dining room, toward the front door. The door opened and shut. Liz ran to the window to see who it was. No one was in sight, nor were there any footprints in the fresh snow that had been falling. This tale, Footsteps, encapsulates much of the inherent terror of growing up and straddling the transition from child to adult. Liz is presumably a middle or high schooler, young enough to still be a schoolgirl who lives at home, but old enough to have time management skills and stay up late, and be trusted to watch her sister while their mother is out. This is a scary and uncertain transition for kids to go through, and that tense uncertainty is pristinely personified by the footsteps she hears throughout her house, but whose owner she never sees, who seems to vanish into thin air the moment he leaves. For many teenagers, the experience of caring for a younger sibling by oneself or babysitting for little children is their first tangible experience of adult responsibility, and they can feel just as alone as if there were no children present. The terror of being by themselves in a dark house is ratcheted upward. It's no wonder that stories like our next one have become so popular among teenagers trying to navigate their newfound responsibilities, especially when what haunts the protagonist of this story is not just a spirit, but very, very human. It was 9 o'clock in the evening. Everybody was sitting on the couch in front of the TV. There were Richard, Brian, Jenny, and Doreen, the babysitter. The telephone rang.
Maybe it's your mother,
said Doreen. She picked up the phone. Before she could say a word, a man laughed hysterically and hung up.
Who was it?
Asked Richard.
Some nut,
said Doreen.
What did I miss?
At 9:30, the telephone rang again. Doreen answered it. It was the man who had called before. "I'll be there soon," he said, and he laughed and hung up.
Who was it?
The children asked.
Some crazy person,
she said. About 10 o'clock, the phone rang again. Jenny got to it first.
Hello?
She said. It was the same man. "1 more hour," he said, and he laughed and hung up.
He said 1 more hour. What did he mean?
Asked Jenny.
Don't worry,
said Doreen.
It's somebody fooling around. I'm scared,
said Jenny. About 10:30, the telephone rang once more. When Doreen picked it up, the man said, "Pretty soon now," and he laughed.
Why are you doing this?
Doreen screamed, and he hung up.
Was it that guy again?
Asked Brian.
Yes,
said Doreen.
I'm going to call the operator and complain.
The operator told her to call back if it happened again, and she would try to trace the call. At 11 o'clock, the telephone rang again. Doreen answered it. "Very soon now," the man said, and he laughed and hung up. Doreen called the operator. Almost at once, she called back. "That person is calling from a telephone upstairs," she said. "You'd better leave. I'll get the police." Just then, a door upstairs opened. A man they had never seen before started down the stairs toward them. As they ran from the house, he was smiling in a very strange way. A few minutes later, the police found him there and arrested him. Alvin Schwartz's version of this classic modern legend came from a 16-year-old boy named Jeff Rosen in Pennsylvania in 1980. The tale itself can't be any older than the 1960s, but the story, now commonly known as The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs, has become so popular today that there's hardly a teenager who hasn't heard it in some way, and it's inspired movies like When a Stranger Calls and Black Christmas. This is actually a rare case in which Schwartz's version of a story is far less gruesome than the commonly told version. Most tellings of The Babysitter end far worse for the titular heroine and her charges. More often than not, the children are already asleep upstairs when the calls start coming in, and have already been killed by the intruder by the time the babysitter learns that the calls are coming from inside the house. In some even more chilling versions, there are no phone calls from the intruder at all. Instead, it is the babysitter who calls the children's parents, asking if she can remove a disturbing life-size clown statue that she was startled by while putting the children to bed. The parents then respond in terror, "We don't have a life-size clown statue! Call the police!" In all its variations, though, this tale plays on the fears we have about the spaces where we live. Our houses are supposed to keep us safe inside by keeping the outside out. While this typically works for nature, though, other human beings are far better at getting past our defenses. And fear can often make it seem as though every exhaustible security precaution might all be for naught in the face of a particularly clever intruder. Seldom do the tellings of this tale explain who the murderous intruder is, or why he is there, or how he has gotten in. It relies on the common understanding that the things we build are never perfect, and terror can creep in through any crack. What's more, since the advent of the landline, the telephone has been the favored communication device of Western youth, lasting into the modern smartphone craze. Whereas many older scholars hear this legend as somehow condemning teenagers' frequent use of the telephone, I hear it, as the youth who first invented it likely intended, as perverting the machine that we so dearly rely on today. Like the house the babysitter is in, the telephone is imperfect, unprotecting, compromised. We feel warmth and security with our phones just like we do with our houses. How terrifying is it indeed, then, to imagine that the dangers of the outside world could use them both against us. It's a horrifying tale, and it makes a lasting impact. Without any resident ghouls or ghosts, it's even possible to imagine this exact scenario occurring today. The fact is, though, that the central motif of the most popular tellings of the legend, a killer whose phone calls can be traced to be coming from inside the house, simply lacks the ring of truth. In the 1960s, when the legend was first formulated, it wasn't actually possible to call someone on the same landline as the phone you were using. And even though the development of phone technology has made such a thing possible nowadays, it still takes far more to trace a call than the story would have you believe. For one thing, the caller would have to remain on the line for longer than a minute, and even then, to trace the call in the first place, the operator would have to obtain a warrant. It's much more likely the police would simply have been sent to the house to check on the babysitter and her charges, at which point the intruder would have been discovered nevertheless. So, in spite of all the fears this tale conjures up for us, we can rest assured that, no matter how often it's told as having happened to someone's friend of a friend, this tale is based in only that, fear. Our last story for this visit round the campfire will be a similar tale that emerged much more recently, sometime in the 90s via chain emails. A story that plays on the same innate fears of being on your own in a dark, dark house, and of dangerous outside forces making their way in. It was late. Regan was home alone babysitting her little sister Mary. Their mother had gone out of town to care for their sick great-aunt, and wouldn't be back until the following night. Regan and Mary had stayed home so as to not miss school the next morning. Little Mary was sound asleep in her bed upstairs, and Regan was on the couch watching her favorite late-night television show. Just beyond the TV, the massive glass windows of the living room looked out on the dark, cold night outside. Curled up within the smothering weight of her blanket, Regan drifted in and out of sleep, her eyes shifting often to the window to glance out at the light snowfall. Around midnight, she woke groggily and peered out of her blanket at the TV, and then at the window. The dark room was lit only by the glow of the TV screen and the soft moonlight outside. She stiffened with fright as she saw a man outside the window, holding a large knife in his hand. The man crept by, quietly, in the direction of their front door, and disappeared from view. Confused whether she had really seen what she thought she saw, Regan stayed still in her blanket, staring out the window in terror. Soon the man was back again, walking now in the other direction, toward their back door. Good, she thought. He wasn't able to get in. But she couldn't remember whether the back door was locked or not, and she was too afraid to move from her blankets in case he would notice her. As soon as the man was gone out of sight again, Regan reached for the phone by the couch and called 911. The operator told her to stay put, and the police were on their way. Regan huddled back into the blanket until she saw police lights through the front window and heard a knock on the front door. She opened the door eagerly for the officers. One of them sat with her in the living room, while the other checked outside around the house. However, there were no footprints leading from the front door to the back door around the house.
"But how can that be?"
Regan asked.
"I know I saw him."
That was when the officers noticed the big, wet footprints inside the house, leading from the unlocked back door, behind the couch, and up the staircase by the front door, up to Mary's room.